Zekthor sat in the corner of the dimly lit cantina, his forearms wrapped tightly around his drink. The amber liquid inside the glass trembled with each subtle shake of his hands. Around him, other species laughed and talked, their voices mixing into a comfortable buzz that helped drown out the memories that always lurked at the edge of his mind. He had been a decorated warrior once. The scars across his chitinous exoskeleton told stories of battles fought across 3 star systems. His people, the Kethvar, were known throughout the galaxy as fierce fighters. Their natural armor could deflect most energy weapons, and their 4 arms made them deadly in close combat. For 200 years, Zekthor had served in the Galactic Defense Force, earning respect and fear from enemies across countless worlds. But that was before he met the humans. The cantina's holographic display flickered to life, showing the daily news. Zekthor's compound eyes caught a familiar symbol, the blue and white flag of the Human Colonial Alliance. His breathing became rapid and shallow. The drink slipped from his trembling grasp, shattering on the metal floor. "Not again," he whispered in his native tongue, pressing his palms against his head. The bartender, a friendly Zelonian with soft purple skin, approached with concern. "Zekthor, you're having another episode. Should I call the medical center?" Zekthor shook his head violently. "No doctors, they don't understand. None of them understand what the humans are capable of." The memories crashed over him like a tidal wave. 23 years ago, during the Kepler Rebellion, his unit had been sent to deal with what their commanders called a minor human insurgency. The briefings had been dismissive. Humans were new to the galactic stage, barely 2 centuries since their first contact. They were physically weak compared to most species, with thin skin that could be pierced by even basic weapons. Their reaction times were slower than most races, and they lacked natural armor or enhanced senses. "Easy assignment," his commanding officer had said. "These humans have been causing trouble in the outer colonies. A show of force should send them running back to their little blue world." Zekthor had believed it. They all had. The first human settlement they encountered seemed to prove their assumptions correct. The colonists surrendered without firing a shot when 3 Galactic Defense Force cruisers appeared in orbit. Zekthor remembered feeling almost disappointed as they rounded up the farmers and miners. These soft, pale creatures hardly seemed worth the reputation for stubbornness that had preceded them. But then came the second settlement, and everything changed. The humans there didn't surrender. When the GDF forces landed, they found empty buildings and silent streets. Zekthor's unit had spread out to search for the colonists, expecting to find them hiding in basements or storage areas. Instead, they found something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The first trap had been simple, a concealed pit filled with sharpened stakes. Ensign Veltar had fallen through a camouflaged covering and been impaled. But it wasn't just the trap that disturbed Zekthor. It was the fact that the stakes were made from the bones of some large animal, carved and sharpened with primitive tools. The humans had used whatever they could find to create weapons. "They're more resourceful than we thought," his lieutenant had muttered, but even then, none of them truly understood. The second trap was more sophisticated. Motion sensors rigged to mining explosives, hidden in the walls of what looked like an abandoned school. 3 more soldiers died in the blast. But still, the human colonists remained hidden. It was on the 3rd day that Zekthor first saw them fight. A group of GDF soldiers had been checking the settlement's power plant when the humans finally revealed themselves. They didn't charge with battle cries or challenge their enemies to honorable combat as most species would. They simply appeared from holes in the ground, from behind false walls, from inside machinery that shouldn't have been able to hide a full-grown human. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes, but in that time, Zekthor watched in horror as 12 trained Galactic Defense Force soldiers were systematically eliminated by what appeared to be ordinary human colonists. No two humans used the same tactics. Some used jury-rigged energy weapons that fired in patterns no military training had prepared them for. Others used crude explosives that seemed to ignore standard armor configurations. Still others fought with improvised melee weapons that somehow found the weak points in GDF battlesuits with frightening precision. But what truly terrified Zekthor wasn't their weapons or their tactics. It was their faces. The humans showed no joy in battle, no rage, no fear. They moved with cold, calculated efficiency. When one of them was wounded, a projectile through the shoulder that would have incapacitated most species, the humans simply switched to using their other arm and continued fighting. When their improvised weapons ran out of power, they picked up rocks, pieces of metal, anything that could be used to cause harm. One human, a female who couldn't have weighed more than half of what Zekthor did, had grabbed a plasma cutter from the power plant and modified it in real time during the battle. She used it to cut through the armor of GDF soldiers like it was made of paper. When Zekthor tried to stop her, she looked directly into his compound eyes with her small, round human eyes, and he saw something there that made his blood freeze. There was no hatred in those eyes, no anger, just a cold, calculating assessment of how best to end his life. Zekthor had fled. For the first time in 2 centuries of military service, he had turned and run from a battle. He made it back to the command post, babbling about the humans and their unnatural fighting methods. His commanding officer had laughed. "Zekthor, you've been in too many battles. These are just colonists with some mining equipment. We'll bring in heavy artillery and end this quickly." But the humans were gone when the artillery arrived. They had vanished into the landscape as completely as if they had never existed. The only evidence of the battle was the bodies of GDF soldiers and some blood stains where wounded humans had been dragged away by their companions. The campaign on Kepler lasted 8 more months. Every settlement was the same story. The humans would appear to be defeated, then strike back with tactics that seemed to come from nowhere. They used the environment itself as a weapon, turning forests into mazes of traps, cities into death traps, and even empty space into an ambush zone with carefully placed debris fields. In the cantina, Zekthor forced himself to take slow, deep breaths. The news display had moved on to other stories, but his hands still shook. Around him, the normal sounds of conversation had resumed, but he barely heard them. A new patron entered the cantina, a Therian trader with the typical gray skin and elongated limbs of his species. He sat down near Zekthor and ordered a drink, then noticed the broken glass on the floor. "Rough day?" the Therian asked casually. Zekthor looked at him with haunted eyes. "You ever fought humans?" The trader shook his head. "No, but I've heard stories. They're supposed to be pretty tough for such a small species." "Tough," Zekthor repeated, almost laughing. "They're not tough. Tough implies they can take damage and keep fighting. Humans are something else entirely. They're—" He struggled to find the right words. "They're adaptation given form. You hurt them, they learn from it. You defeat them, they come back stronger. You think you understand their tactics, and they do something no sane military mind would ever consider?" The Therian looked intrigued. "What do you mean?" Zekthor closed his eyes, remembering. "On Kepler, we thought we had them figured out after the first few encounters. Hit-and-run tactics, environmental warfare, improvised weapons, standard guerrilla fighting. So we adapted our strategy, brought in sensor drones to track their movements, used orbital surveillance to watch for hidden bases." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That's when they started sending children." The Therian's eyes widened. "Children?" "Human offspring, maybe 12 or 13 of their years old." They would approach our camps with their hands up, claiming they were hungry refugees. Of course, we couldn't shoot children. Every species in the galaxy has some form of protection for their young. It's basic decency. Zekthor's voice became hollow. But these human children had explosives hidden in their clothing. Not to kill us. The charges were too small for that. Just to damage our equipment, destroy our supplies, and then escape in the confusion. They sacrificed their own safety, risked their own lives, just to gain a small tactical advantage. That's, the Therian started, but couldn't finish. Monstrous, evil, that's what we thought too. But then we realized the truth. To humans, it wasn't evil. It was simply another tool in their arsenal. They weren't sending their children to die. They were sending their most overlooked and underestimated members to strike at us where we were psychologically vulnerable. The children volunteered. They understood the risks and chose to take them for their people. Zekthor opened his eyes and stared at the traitor. That's when I knew we weren't fighting soldiers. We weren't even fighting a species. We were fighting an entire race that had turned survival into an art form so refined that every single one of them, from their youngest to their oldest, was potentially lethal. The cantina seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the very walls were listening to Zekthor's story. The old veteran took a shaky breath and continued. The worst part? They were winning, not through superior firepower or numbers, but through sheer, relentless adaptability. Every tactic we used against them, they found a counter for. Every advantage we pressed, they turned into a disadvantage. By the end of the campaign, GDF Command was rotating units off Kepler every few weeks because the psychological stress was breaking veteran soldiers. The Therian ordered another drink, stronger this time. What happened? How did it end? Zekthor's laugh was bitter and hollow. It didn't end. We withdrew. The mighty Galactic Defense Force, with all our advanced technology and superior military training, retreated from a human colony world because a few thousand colonists with improvised weapons had proven too dangerous to subdue. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady. The memories were too fresh now, too immediate. He needed to get back to his small apartment, back to the bottle of neural suppressants that helped him sleep without dreaming. The official reports called it a strategic redeployment, he said as he prepared to leave. But everyone who was there knew the truth. The humans had shown us something about warfare that we never wanted to see. They had shown us what it looks like when an entire species refuses to accept defeat. As Zekthor walked toward the exit, the Therian called after him. But surely they're not all like that. The humans I've met in trade negotiations seem reasonable enough. Zekthor paused at the doorway, not turning around. That's the most terrifying part of all. They are reasonable. They're kind, generous, curious about other species. They write poetry and create beautiful art and care for their families just like the rest of us. But somewhere inside every single human is the capacity to become something that will do whatever it takes to survive and protect what they love. And once you've seen that capacity unleashed, he trailed off. You never feel safe again, he finished quietly, and disappeared into the night. The neural suppressants weren't working anymore. Zekthor lay in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling as the memories played behind his closed eyes like a horror movie he couldn't turn off. The medication that had once granted him 4 hours of dreamless sleep now barely gave him 30 minutes of peace before the nightmares returned. He rolled off his sleeping platform and walked to the window. The city of New Valos stretched out below him, its glittering lights a stark contrast to the darkness in his mind. Somewhere out there, human ships docked at the commercial ports. Human traders walked the streets. Human families lived normal lives, completely unaware of what their species was capable of when pushed to the edge. The chronometer on his wall chimed softly. It was the anniversary. 23 years to the day since the Battle of Kepler Prime, the engagement that had finally broken his unit's morale completely. Zekthor moved to his personal terminal and pulled up the old mission files. He had clearance to access them, though he suspected no one else ever bothered to read the reports anymore. The Kepler Rebellion was considered a minor footnote in galactic history now, a small colonial dispute that had been resolved through negotiation rather than military force. Only the veterans who had been there knew the real story. The official casualty reports made for grim reading. Over the course of 8 months, the Galactic Defense Force had lost 847 soldiers on Kepler. Not to massed human armies or superior technology, but to small groups of colonists who refused to follow any recognizable pattern of warfare. Zekthor scrolled through the individual incident reports, each one a testament to human ingenuity and ruthlessness. The mining colony that had somehow rigged their entire settlement to collapse in a controlled demolition when GDF forces tried to occupy it. The farming community that had weaponized their agricultural equipment, turning harvesting machines into mobile weapons platforms. The research station where human scientists had created chemical weapons from common household supplies and deployed them through the ventilation system. But those weren't the memories that haunted him most. It was the smaller moments, the personal encounters that had shown him the true nature of human warfare. Like the medic. Zekthor remembered her clearly. Dr. Sarah Chen, according to the identification they had found later. She was a small woman, even by human standards, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When his patrol had found her treating wounded colonists in an improvised medical facility, she had surrendered immediately. "Please," she had said in accented galactic standard, "let me finish treating the injured. They'll die without medical attention." It had seemed reasonable. Even in war, most civilized species respected medical personnel and their duty to save lives. Zekthor's lieutenant had agreed to let her work while they secured the area. For 2 hours, Dr. Chen had moved between the wounded colonists with gentle efficiency. She spoke softly to her patients, gave them water, administered pain medication from her limited supplies. She even treated a GDF soldier who had been injured in a previous skirmish, working with the same careful attention she gave to her own people. When she was finished, she had cleaned her hands carefully and approached the lieutenant. "Thank you for your patience," she said. "I'm ready to come with you now." They had been 3 kilometers away from the medical facility when the explosion started. Dr. Chen had looked back at the rising smoke and flames with the same mild expression she had worn while treating patients. "The medical supplies were contaminated," she explained calmly. "I couldn't let the GDF use them to treat their own wounded. The chemical compounds I introduced will make the entire facility uninhabitable for several weeks." Zekthor had stared at her in shock. "But the colonists you treated—" "Will be fine," Dr. Chen replied. "I gave them actual medicine. The contamination was introduced through the building's water system after I finished my work." That was when Zekthor realized she had been wearing gloves the entire time. Gloves that she had disposed of before leaving the facility. "You poisoned your own medical supplies," the lieutenant said in disbelief. Dr. Chen's kind expression never changed. "I prevented enemy forces from accessing resources that could be used against my people. That's called tactics, I believe." She had been planning it from the moment they found her. Every gentle word to her patients, every seemingly compassionate act, had been part of a larger strategy. She had used their own civilized nature against them, knowing that no GDF officer would prevent a doctor from treating the wounded. The lieutenant had been so disturbed by the encounter that he had requested immediate reassignment. He never spoke of it again, but Zekthor had seen how it changed him. The realization that humans could compartmentalize compassion and ruthlessness so completely was deeply unsettling to most species. But Dr. Chen wasn't an anomaly. As the campaign on Kepler continued, similar incidents multiplied. Humans would surrender peacefully, cooperate fully with their captors, and then reveal that their cooperation was itself a weapon. There was the elderly farmer who had guided GDF troops through a supposedly safe route that led directly into a minefield he had laid himself weeks earlier. When confronted, he had simply said, "You asked for the fastest route to the other settlements. That was it." There was the young mother who had volunteered to help with translation, providing accurate interpretations for weeks before the GDF realized she had been editing their communications to feed false information to her own people's resistance network. There was the teenage boy who had seemed genuinely eager to please his GDF captors, volunteering for every small task and errand. Only after their supply depot exploded did they discover he had been systematically sabotaging equipment and supplies during his helpful visits. Each incident followed the same pattern. The humans would present themselves as cooperative, even friendly. They would meet every expectation of civilized behavior. And then they would reveal that their civility was simply another layer of their strategy. Zekthor closed the files and walked to his kitchen, preparing a simple meal he wouldn't be able to taste. The memories were too strong now, pulling him back to the worst day of the entire campaign. The Battle of Kepler Prime hadn't been a battle at all, really. It had been a demonstration. By that point, the human colonists had been conducting their asymmetric warfare for 7 months. GDF morale was at an all-time low, and Command had decided to end the rebellion with overwhelming force. They had assembled the largest military fleet ever deployed against a single colony world: 3 dreadnoughts, 12 cruisers, and 40 escort vessels. The plan was simple: orbital bombardment of all major population centers, followed by a massive ground assault to secure any survivors. It was brutal, but effective. The humans would finally face the full might of galactic civilization. Zekthor had been part of the advance force, tasked with establishing secure landing zones for the main invasion. His dropship had been one of 50 descending toward the colony's capital city when the humans sprung their final trap. It started with the defense satellites. The colonists had somehow gained access to the orbital weapons platforms that were supposed to protect them. Instead of shooting at the approaching GDF fleet, the satellites began firing on each other. Within minutes, the debris field from destroyed platforms created a maze of high-velocity fragments that made further orbital operations impossible. Clever, Zekthor's pilot had admitted, but it won't save them from ground assault. That's when the second phase began. The landing zones that GDF reconnaissance had identified as clear and secure turned out to be anything but. As the dropships approached, structures that had appeared to be simple buildings revealed themselves as disguised weapons platforms. What looked like water towers were actually missile launchers. Farm silos contained surface-to-air batteries. Even the landing pads themselves were trapped, rigged to collapse under the weight of landing craft. But still, the GDF pressed forward. They had overwhelming numbers and superior equipment. The human colonists might be clever, but they were still just civilians with improvised weapons. That's when Zekthor saw the third phase and understood why the humans had been so confident. The colonists weren't fighting alone. They had allies. It started with the wildlife. Kepler Prime was home to several species of large predatory animals that the colonists had somehow domesticated and trained. These creatures attacked with coordination that suggested months of preparation. But more disturbing was how the humans fought alongside them, as if they had somehow learned to think like pack hunters. Then came the automated systems. The colonists had reprogrammed every piece of technology on the planet to serve as weapons. Agricultural robots became mobile gun platforms. Transportation vehicles turned into kamikaze drones. Even the colony's waste management system had been weaponized, creating toxic gas clouds that forced GDF troops to retreat from entire districts. But the worst part was the environment itself. The humans had been terraforming Kepler Prime for over a century, and they had apparently been planning for this kind of defense the entire time. Every forest had hidden bunkers. Every river had been dammed to create artificial flood zones. Even the weather seemed to be working against the GDF forces, with sudden storms and fog banks appearing exactly when human forces needed cover for their movements. Zekthor had realized with growing horror that the entire planet was a weapon. The humans hadn't just been living on Kepler Prime, they had been preparing it for war. His dropship had crashed when a flock of modified aerial drones swarmed their formation. Zekthor had survived the impact, but found himself alone in hostile territory with a broken communicator and dwindling ammunition. For 3 days, he had tried to make his way back to GDF lines. During that time, he had seen things that still appeared in his nightmares. Humans moving through the landscape like ghosts, seeming to materialize from the ground itself. Children who couldn't have been older than 10 years, teaching each other how to build explosives from salvaged electronics. Elderly colonists who smiled and waved at GDF patrols during the day, then guided resistance fighters to attack those same patrols after dark. But the moment that broke him completely came on the 3rd night. Zekthor had been hiding in an abandoned building trying to rest when he heard voices outside. A GDF patrol was passing nearby, and he had been about to signal them when he realized they were being followed. A human family, parents and 2 young children, were trailing the patrol at a distance. The mother carried what looked like a baby, while the father and older children pushed a cart that seemed to contain their belongings. To any observer, they would have looked like refugees seeking protection from GDF forces. Zekthor watched in fascination as the family maintained perfect formation, staying just close enough to the patrol to appear to be following them, but far enough away to avoid detection. The parents communicated through subtle gestures that kept their children in perfect coordination. When the patrol stopped to rest, the family stopped too. When the patrol changed direction, the family adjusted their course to match. To the GDF soldiers, if they even noticed the family at all, it would have looked like perfectly innocent behavior from frightened civilians. Then the trap was sprung. The baby in the mother's arms was actually a sophisticated scanning device that had been mapping the patrol's equipment and formation for hours. The cart the father and children were pushing contained enough explosives to level a city block, and the family's seemingly random positioning had been carefully calculated to provide maximum tactical advantage when the attack began. The assault lasted less than 60 seconds. The family moved with the precision of a trained military unit, each member executing their role with perfect timing. The parents provided covering fire while the children placed charges at strategically chosen points. When it was over, the entire GDF patrol was dead, and the family was already disappearing back into the landscape as if they had never existed. But before they left, the youngest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, looked directly at Zekthor's hiding place. She met his eyes through the darkness and gave him a small, polite nod of acknowledgement before vanishing into the night. She had known he was there the entire time. The whole family had known. They had deliberately let him live, not out of mercy, but because they wanted a witness. They wanted someone to report back to GDF command about what they had seen. That was the moment Zekthor truly understood what humans were. They weren't just fighters or survivors. They were an entire species that had evolved to treat warfare as a natural extension of family life. Parents teaching children. Children learning from elders. Every generation passing down not just knowledge and culture, but tactical expertise and strategic thinking. When Zekthor had finally made it back to GDF lines, he was barely coherent. His report about the family attack was dismissed as combat stress and hallucinations. But the patrol he had witnessed being destroyed was real enough, and their deaths were added to the growing casualty count that was making the Kepler operation increasingly unpopular with GDF leadership. The official end of the rebellion came 2 weeks later, when GDF command announced that a negotiated settlement had been reached with the colonial government. The humans would be allowed to maintain their independence in exchange for trade agreements and mutual non-aggression pacts, but Zekthor knew the real reason for the withdrawal. The humans had demonstrated something that no military force in the galaxy was equipped to handle. They had shown that they could turn anything, their environment, their technology, their families, even their acts of compassion, into weapons. Fighting them wasn't just defeating an army or occupying territory. It was trying to overcome an entire civilization that had developed warfare into an art form so sophisticated that every single member was a potential combatant, strategist, and weapon all at once. In his apartment, Zekthor finished his tasteless meal and returned to his sleeping platform. Outside his window, the city continued its peaceful existence, unaware that somewhere in its midst lived a species that could transform any environment into a battlefield, any situation into a tactical advantage, and any act of kindness into a potential trap. He closed his eyes and tried once more to sleep, knowing that the nightmares would come anyway. In his dreams, he would see that 8-year-old human girl nodding at him in the darkness, acknowledging his presence with the casual confidence of someone who had already calculated 17 different ways to kill him if necessary. The worst part was that she had probably been right. The message arrived on a routine Tuesday morning, transmitted through official GDF channels with the kind of bureaucratic formatting that made it look like just another piece of military correspondence. Zekthor almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was another request for him to participate in veteran support groups or psychological evaluation programs. But something about the sender's identification code made him pause. It was a human designation, HCA Diplomatic 7749. The Human Colonial Alliance was contacting him directly. With trembling hands, he opened the message. Former Sergeant Zekthor of the 42nd Galactic Defense Force Infantry Division. This is Ambassador Elena Vasquez of the Human Colonial Alliance Diplomatic Corps. We would like to request a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss matters of mutual importance relating to your service on Kepler Prime. Please respond if you are willing to meet. This communication is being sent with the full knowledge and approval of GDF Command. Zekthor stared at the message for a long time. 23 years of nightmares, and now the humans wanted to talk. His first instinct was to delete the message and pretend he had never received it. But something in the formal, respectful tone nagged at him. The humans could have demanded a meeting through official channels. Instead, they were asking. Another trap, his paranoid mind whispered. They're using politeness as a weapon again. But curiosity won out over fear. 3 days later, he found himself sitting in a neutral meeting room at the New Valos diplomatic complex, waiting for his first face-to-face encounter with a human since Kepler Prime. Ambassador Vasquez was not what he had expected. She was middle-aged, with silver-streaked brown hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She wore a simple business suit in dark blue, with no visible weapons or defensive equipment. When she entered the room, she moved with the careful, non-threatening manner of someone who understood exactly how intimidating her species could be to others. Sergeant Zekthor, she said, inclining her head respectfully. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this can't be easy. Zekthor's 4 arms tensed involuntarily. Even her voice was a weapon, warm and soothing, designed to lower his guard. What do you want? Ambassador Vasquez sat down across from him, keeping her hands visible on the table. To apologize first and foremost, and then to ask for your help. Apologize? Zekthor's mandibles clicked together in confusion. For what? For what we put you through on Kepler. For what we put all of your people through. Her expression grew serious. We know about your struggles since the war. The nightmares, the isolation, the fear. We know because we've been monitoring the psychological effects of that conflict on GDF veterans. Zekthor felt a chill run through his exoskeleton. You've been watching us? Not watching, Vasquez corrected gently. Studying. We've been funding research into combat stress disorders, specifically among aliens who encountered human warfare tactics. We've established treatment programs, developed new therapeutic techniques, and created support networks. All anonymously, of course. She slid a datapad across the table. The neural suppressants you've been taking, the improved formulation that became available 3 years ago, that was our research. The Veteran Support Center that opened in your district last year, we helped fund it. The new therapy protocols that GDF Medical Services started using, we developed them. Zekthor picked up the datapad with shaking hands. The information was all there. Detailed psychological studies, medical research projects, funding records, dozens of programs designed to help alien veterans cope with the trauma of fighting humans. "Why?" he whispered. Ambassador Vasquez leaned back in her chair. "Because we realized something during the Kepler conflict that horrified us. We had become so focused on survival that we forgot about the psychological impact we were having on others. We were treating warfare like a chess game, and we forgot that our opponents were living beings with their own fears and trauma responses." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The tactics we used on Kepler, they weren't designed to be cruel. They were designed to be effective. But we didn't consider what it would do to soldiers who had never encountered that kind of warfare before." Zekthor looked up from the datapad. "The children. You sent children into battle." "We didn't send them," Vasquez replied quietly. "They volunteered. That's how human families work. When the adults are in danger, the children step up to protect them. But we should have realized how that would look to species who have stronger age-based protective instincts than we do." "And the traps? The psychological warfare?" "Standard human tactics dating back thousands of years. But most species fight wars of territory and resources. They're not prepared for wars of ideology and survival." She met his compound eyes directly. "We weren't trying to torture you, Sergeant. We were trying to make you leave. There's a difference, though I realize that difference might not have been clear to you at the time." Zekthor set the datapad down. "You said you needed my help." Ambassador Vasquez nodded. "There's going to be another conflict. The hegemony of Vel is expanding aggressively into human space. Our colonies along the frontier are reporting increasing incidents of harassment and resource theft. Diplomatic protests have been ignored." Zekthor felt his breathing become rapid. "You're going to war with the hegemony." "We're going to defend our colonies," Vasquez corrected. "The hegemony leadership seems to believe that humans are weak because we backed down from direct confrontation during the Kepler incident. They think our withdrawal was a sign of military weakness rather than political pragmatism. And you want me to tell them they're wrong? I want you to help us avoid repeating the mistakes we made on Kepler." Vasquez leaned forward. "We've learned a lot about psychological warfare in the past 23 years, not just how to use it, but how to minimize the long-term trauma it causes. We've developed protocols for dealing with enemy civilians, guidelines for minimizing psychological damage to opposing forces, and techniques for achieving strategic objectives without creating the kind of lasting trauma that you experienced." She slid another datapad across the table. "This is a preliminary strategic plan for defending our frontier colonies. It incorporates everything we learned from studying the psychological aftermath of Kepler. We want to win, but we want to do it in a way that doesn't leave our opponents broken and haunted." Zekthor picked up the second datapad, scanning through tactical analyses and psychological impact assessments. The documents were nothing like the brutal efficiency reports from Kepler. Instead, they read like carefully balanced equations, seeking maximum strategic effect with minimum long-term psychological damage. "You want me to review your war plans? I want you to tell us if we're making the same mistakes again." Vasquez's voice carried genuine concern. "You've seen human warfare from the receiving end. You understand how our tactics affect other species. We need that perspective." Zekthor scrolled through more of the documents. The tactical plans were still recognizably human, adaptive, innovative, psychologically sophisticated. But there were new elements, too. Provisions for psychological support for enemy combatants, guidelines for minimizing civilian trauma, protocols for post-conflict reconstruction that included mental health services for former opponents. "The hegemony won't appreciate your consideration for their mental health," he said finally. "The hegemony won't get a choice," Vasquez replied, with a slight smile that reminded Zekthor exactly why humans were so terrifying. "But the individual soldiers who fight us deserve better than what we gave your people on Kepler." Zekthor looked at the ambassador for a long moment. She was doing it again, using compassion as a tactical advantage. But this time, the compassion seemed genuine. Or perhaps that was just another layer of the strategy. "If I help you," he said slowly, "I want something in return." "Name it. I want to meet them. The colonists from Kepler. I want to talk to the people who did this to me." He gestured at his trembling hands, his haunted expression. Ambassador Vasquez smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "I was hoping you would ask for that. They've been wanting to meet you too." 2 weeks later, Zekthor found himself on a passenger transport bound for Kepler Prime. The journey took 6 days, and he spent most of them reviewing the files Ambassador Vasquez had given him. The humans had indeed learned from their earlier conflict. Their new tactical doctrines were no less effective than their old ones, but they were designed with an understanding of how psychological warfare affected different species. When the transport dropped out of hyperspace, Zekthor saw Kepler Prime for the first time in over 2 decades. The planet looked different now, more developed, with orbital stations and shipping lanes that spoke of peaceful prosperity. The scars of the rebellion were gone, replaced by the infrastructure of a thriving colonial world. Dr. Sarah Chen was waiting for him at the spaceport. She was older now, her hair completely gray and her face lined with decades of experience. But her eyes were the same, kind and intelligent, with just a hint of the calculating mind that had once terrified him. She approached him slowly, respectfully, keeping her hands visible. "Sergeant Zekthor," she said in Galactic Standard that had improved considerably since their last meeting. "Welcome back to Kepler." Zekthor studied her face, looking for any sign of the coldly efficient resistance fighter he remembered. But all he saw was a tired-looking elderly woman who seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "Dr. Chen, you remember me?" "Of course I remember you. You were there during the worst period of my life." She smiled sadly. "I poisoned my own medical supplies to keep them from helping your wounded comrades. That's not the kind of thing a doctor forgets." "Then why did you want to meet with me?" "Because I wanted to explain something that I couldn't say 23 years ago." She gestured toward a waiting ground car. "Would you ride with me? There are some people who would like to see you." The drive took them through the colonial capital, which had grown from a small settlement into a proper city. Humans went about their daily lives, working, shopping, raising their children. It looked utterly normal, completely at odds with Zekthor's memories of a planet-sized trap. "We weren't soldiers," Dr. Chen said as they drove. "That's what I wanted you to understand. We were just people who were trying to protect our homes and families. Everything we did, the traps, the psychological warfare, the use of children in dangerous roles, it all came from desperation, not training." "It was effective," Zekthor said quietly. "It was monstrous," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "Effective doesn't mean right. We traumatized an entire generation of GDF soldiers because we were too afraid to consider alternatives to violence." She pulled the car into a parking area beside a large building that looked like some kind of community center. "That's why we built this place. It's a memorial and research center dedicated to understanding the psychological costs of asymmetric warfare. We've been working with human and alien psychologists for 20 years to develop better approaches to colonial defense. Inside the building, Zekthor found displays chronicling the Kepler rebellion from multiple perspectives. There were exhibits showing GDF tactical analyses alongside human resistance planning documents. Video testimonies from veterans of both sides described their experiences and trauma. Interactive displays demonstrated how different species processed psychological stress and how warfare tactics could be modified to minimize long-term damage. But the most striking display was in the center of the main hall, a wall covered with photographs and personal messages from GDF veterans who had served on Kepler. Hundreds of faces from dozens of species with short descriptions of their post-war lives and struggles. Zekthor found his own photograph near the center of the display. Below it was a brief description of his service record and a note that read, "Currently receiving treatment for combat-related stress disorders, has declined interview requests, but remains in contact with veteran support services." "We've been following the stories of everyone who served here," Dr. Chen explained. "Not to spy on them, but to understand the impact our actions had on their lives. Every person on this wall represents someone whose life we changed, often for the worse. Why show this publicly? Because we want our children to understand the real cost of the choices we made." Dr. Chen pointed to a group of young humans who were studying the displays. "The next generation needs to know that there are consequences to treating warfare as a game of tactics and strategy. Every clever trap, every psychological manipulation, every successful operation created real trauma for real people." As they walked through the memorial, other colonists approached to meet Zekthor. Some he recognized from his nightmares: the elderly farmer who had guided GDF troops into minefields, the teenage boy who had sabotaged their equipment, even members of the family who had destroyed the patrol while he watched. All of them were older now, carrying the weight of decades, and all of them wanted to apologize. "We were protecting our families," the farmer said, his weathered hands shaking as much as Zekthor's. "But that doesn't excuse what we put you through. We thought GDF soldiers were just obstacles to overcome," the former teenage saboteur admitted. "We didn't think about you as individuals with your own fears and trauma responses." The family who had destroyed the patrol introduced themselves properly: the Nakamura family. The little girl who had nodded at him in the darkness was now a woman in her 30s, with children of her own. "I've had nightmares about that night for 23 years, she told him. "Not because I regretted what we did to protect our colony, but because I realized later what it must have looked like to you. Watching a family coordinate an attack like that, it must have been like seeing something inhuman." "It was," Zekthor said honestly. "It broke something in my mind that never healed." "We know," she replied. "That's why we've spent the last 2 decades trying to find better ways to defend ourselves. Ways that don't turn ordinary people into the kinds of monsters we became." Over the following days, Zekthor met with dozens of former resistance fighters. Each conversation helped him understand something that had eluded him for 23 years. The humans of Kepler hadn't been warriors. They had been ordinary people pushed to extraordinary measures by circumstances they couldn't control. Their tactical brilliance hadn't come from military training or natural aggression. It had come from the same creativity and adaptability that allowed humans to excel in science, art, and exploration. When survival was threatened, those qualities had been turned toward warfare with terrifying effectiveness, but the cost had been enormous, not just for their opponents, but for the humans themselves. Many of the former resistance fighters suffered from their own psychological scars. The doctor who had poisoned medical supplies struggled with the violation of her medical oath. The parents who had trained their children to fight carried guilt about exposing them to violence. The elderly colonists who had sacrificed their traditional roles as protected community members dealt with the trauma of becoming combatants. "We didn't just break your minds," Dr. Chen told him on his final day on Kepler. "We broke our own." Before leaving, Zekthor made one final stop at the memorial. He stood before the wall of GDF veteran photographs for a long time, thinking about the men and women who had served alongside him. Some had recovered and built new lives. Others, like him, continued to struggle with the memories. A few had never made it home at all. Dr. Chen approached him quietly. "What will you tell Ambassador Vasquez?" Zekthor considered the question carefully. "I'll tell her that humans are still the most dangerous species in the galaxy when it comes to warfare. But I'll also tell her that you've learned to be dangerous with purpose, instead of just surviving with desperation." "And the hegemony?" Zekthor's mandibles clicked in what might have been dark amusement. "The hegemony thinks they understand human warfare because they've read tactical analyses and casualty reports. They have no idea what they're actually facing." He turned to face Dr. Chen directly. "The humans who fought on Kepler were terrifying because you were fighting for survival. The humans who will face the hegemony will be terrifying because you're fighting with 23 years of experience and careful psychological planning. You've turned warfare into a science." "Is that better or worse?" Zekthor thought about the strategic documents he had reviewed, with their careful balance of effectiveness and humanitarian consideration. For the hegemony? Much worse. For the galaxy as a whole? Probably better. As his transport lifted off from Kepler Prime, Zekthor felt something he hadn't experienced in over 2 decades, a sense of closure. The nightmares would probably never completely go away, but now he understood their source. He had been traumatized not by monsters, but by ordinary people who had been forced to become something extraordinary by circumstances beyond their control. More importantly, he understood that those people had been traumatized too. The psychological scars of warfare weren't limited to the losing side. Everyone who participated in violence paid a price, even if they survived and achieved their objectives. When he returned to New Valos, Zekthor submitted his analysis of the human strategic plans to Ambassador Vasquez. His recommendations were extensive and detailed, incorporating everything he had learned about human psychology and tactical thinking. "Will this help prevent another Kepler?" Vasquez asked after reviewing his report. "Nothing can prevent war if the hegemony is determined to have one," Zekthor replied. "But this will help ensure that when the fighting is over, both sides can live with the memory of what they did." He paused, thinking of Dr. Chen and the memorial wall. The goal isn't to make warfare pleasant. The goal is to make it something that people can recover from. Ambassador Vasquez nodded thoughtfully. "And if the hegemony proves unwilling to listen to reason?" Zekthor's expression grew grim. "Then they'll learn the same lesson we did on Kepler. Humans aren't just dangerous because of your tactics or your adaptability. You're dangerous because you never stop thinking about how to be better at whatever you need to do, even warfare." "That sounds ominous." "It should," Zekthor said. "But for the first time in 23 years, I'm not afraid of humans anymore. I'm afraid for anyone who decides to fight them without understanding what that really means." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Ambassador, when the hegemony realizes they've made a mistake, will you remember what you learned from Kepler?" "What do you mean?" "Will you help them surrender with their dignity intact? Will you remember that their soldiers are people too?" Ambassador Vasquez smiled with the kind of warm, calculating expression that reminded Zekthor exactly why humans had been so successful on Kepler. "That's the plan, Sergeant. That's always been the plan." As Zekthor walked away, he realized that perhaps the most terrifying thing about humans wasn't their tactical brilliance or their adaptability. It was their capacity to learn from their mistakes and become even more effective while still maintaining their essential humanity. The hegemony had no idea what they were about to face. But unlike 23 years ago, Zekthor found himself almost feeling sorry for them.